G'day, ZiggyD here, and welcome to the beginner's guide for the Foxtactic style Arc Lightning Witch. Foxtactic's name has become synonymous with the Arc Witch due to his extended work on his Lightning Ninja, Righteous Archer, and Righteous Surgeon builds. Over the past 7 days, I designed and leveled a slight variation of Fox's Arc Witch concept in order to document and practice what I believe to be a really potent build for beginners and experienced players alike. And in this video, I'll break down exactly what makes this build so strong, and how to build one for yourself. Arc has been in Path of Exile for a long time, but it was always considered way too weak to use as a primary skill. However, it was somewhat recently given a huge damage boost and is now widely considered to be one of the strongest skills in the game. It's extremely easy to use thanks to the way it automatically targets and jumps between monsters, and its damage scales very effectively on top of that. It's also very capable of applying the shocked status ailment quickly to large groups of monsters, which increases the damage they take by an extra 30 to 90%. When I was deciding on a beginner's build to pick, Arc really stood out to me as the perfect skill to pick. I'd recently watched 2 fairly new players using it, and they had a really easy time leveling and getting into endgame, and after playing it myself over the past 7 days as well, I can safely say it's fast, fun, and easy to use. This build uses Arc in 2 different ways. The first is a self-cast instance of the skill, and is your primary means of dealing damage. We support Arc with Spell Echo for a large increase in cast speed, Lightning Penetration for a huge effective damage increase, and Empower to boost the base damage of the spell. Before you obtain Empower, you can alternatively use added lightning damage, and this works quite well. You'll notice that this is only 4 gems. This build can actually get by without ever needing to purchase an expensive 5 or 6 linked item. This is partially thanks to the raw power of Arc, but also thanks to the Helmet Joffrey's Crest, which gives +1 to level of all gems in the setup, including Empower, which then boosts Arc again even further in turn. The total damage of this setup will exceed most 6-link setups. As a side note, you can even get by with just a 3-link. If you find a one with +2 to lightning gems and +1 to all gems in this item, you can run Arc with Echo and Lightning Penetration and still have plenty of damage for endgame maps. This sort of setup is extremely cheap and can be used until you get your level 2 Empower and Joffrey's Crest. The second instance of Arc we use is a spell totem designed to spread stacks of the shock status elements amongst enemies. It will deal some supplementary damage itself, but its primary role is to debuff enemies, boosting the damage that you deal to them yourself. This second instance of Arc also works just fine on a 4-link. We use Arc, Spell Totem, Elemental Proliferation, and Lightning Penetration. Elemental Proliferation is the key here, as whenever an enemy is shocked, Elemental Proliferation spreads that shock stack to other nearby enemies. This results in very quick triple shock stacking of enemies. Later on, you can extend this into a 5 or 6 link setup if you want by adding faster casting and quality added lightning. Using a quality Arc in this setup is also of great benefit as it increases the chance for you to shock your enemies. For mobility, this build uses the thematically perfect Lightning Warp. When supported by fast casting and reduced duration, this becomes an extremely fast movement skill. It can be used to cover ground quickly when getting around maps, to get yourself out of danger, and even to take shortcuts over obstacles and ledges. To support our damage dealing, we use the Conductivity Curse to lower enemy lightning resistance and to increase their susceptibility to shock stacks. When in a party, we can switch this out for Elemental Weakness to boost both our damage and that of our party instead. The auras this character uses include Clarity, Discipline, and Purity of Lightning. Clarity and Discipline, along with Eldritch Battery Keystone passive, afford us a huge amount of mana and mana regeneration. Purity of Lightning provides lightning resistance and an increase to our maximum lightning resistance as well. This helps deal with reflected lightning damage and some other pretty nasty lightning baddies throughout different maps. One of the great things about this character is the flexibility it has, and one such example of this is that it can at any time switch out Purity of Lightning for Purity of Elements or either of the other Purity auras to aid with gearing and other nasty bosses. Thanks to the aforementioned huge mana regen from Clarity, Discipline, and Eldritch Battery, we can also run a very high level of the defensive skill Arctic Armor. Arctic Armor consumes large amounts of mana over time, especially while moving, but it provides protection from physical and fire attacks. At high levels, it becomes so potent that it can make you completely immune to certain enemies like Voidbearers and Tentacle Miscreations. And just for added fun, quality Arctic Armor will also give you a boost to move speed, making you zip around maps a little bit faster. Finally, I like to run the Val Haste aura on this character as well to provide a large DPS boost against large packs of enemies or against bosses. This helps counter the average single target damage of Arc. So now let's talk about the playstyle and methodology of using this build. A typical engagement using this Arc Witch begins with lightning warping around the map to find your prey. Once spotting the enemy, you'll place your totem near the enemy, but kind of out of the way of the majority of damage. The totem can eat a few hits, but his primary goal is to get those shock stacks out as soon as possible. You'll then follow up with a curse, conductivity, before unleashing your own continuous stream of arcs. Basically, you will hold down the button until everything is dead. If you take too much damage, you can lightning warp to safety and start the process again. If the pack of enemies is rather tough, or if we're facing a boss for example, we can use the combination of Vaal Haste and the Atziri's Promise Flask to boost our DPS whilst also providing additional tankiness thanks to the bonus leech from the Flask. Topaz Flask can be used to counter reflect packs, and the Granite Flask is used whenever there is a danger of physical attacks. I'd also like to include a quick rundown of how I leveled this character in this guide as well. The leveling process goes extremely smoothly, one of the smoothest I've ever played. It has access to a lot of life and damage early on in the passive tree, and thanks to easily available weapon vendor recipes and the scaling of Arc, you'll progress at a very steady pace. In terms of the leveling skills, I recommend starting off with Fireball plus Fire Trap, and then you can transition into Fire Trap plus Stormcall, and then finally Stormcall and Arc, and eventually you'll transition into your final setup of self-casted Arc and then an Arc spell totem. Early on, you'll want to craft yourself a powerful leveling weapon using the following method. Simply find a 3-link wand or scepter in the vendors, try and aim for the highest spell or elemental damage base item you can find, and then if it's white, use a transmutation orb to make it a magic tier weapon. Then you sell it to a vendor along with an Orb of Alteration and a Topaz Ring, which can also be purchased via the vendor, and you'll get back a weapon with +1 to the level of lightning gems in this item. Simply socket your Stormcall and later Arc into this weapon for a huge damage boost. You can also augment this weapon for a chance at additional damage or cast speed. And now I want to talk a bit about the strengths and weaknesses of this build to give you a good idea of what you're actually getting yourself into before you play it. Arc builds like this are built to farm or progress in endgame maps, that's their primary focus. The damage versus small to large packs of enemies is really good. Single target damage and boss killing is passable, but certainly not exceptional however. When you're in solo play, you can counter the lack of single target damage with the Atziri's Promise Flask and Vaal Haste like I've done, but the best strategy is to play with parties. Playing with a good party, your lack of single target damage is not an issue and you'll contribute a huge amount of DPS when clearing the rest of the map. Thanks to the potency of Arc shock stacking, you will also greatly amplify the damage of your party members as well, and Arca is always a welcome addition to a well-rounded party. The next strength is that this build is fast. Fast cast speed means it attacks very quickly, and with Lightning Warp you can get around the map very quickly as well. You'll usually lead most parties as a result, and when playing solo you'll fly around the maps. This also makes it quite fun to play as a positive side effect. Another solid entry into the strengths category is ease of play. The auto-aiming of Arc means that you don't need to manually target enemies. There is a slight drawback to this though, in that sometimes it can be a bit hard to focus fire things like Necromancers and Vaal Totems, but this is kind of a small detail. In terms of defensive strengths and weaknesses, the build is extremely resilient versus any sort of elemental damage, and thanks to Arctic armor it's also flat out immune to some of the more scary bosses and monsters in the game, like the Cells map Voidbearer and the Crematorian Fire Fury. Thanks to the high lightning resistance and running a Topaz Flask always, Dominus and Piety are also a breeze for example. However, physical damage is a bit of a weakness with this build. We have low mitigation against frequent large hits of physical damage. Thanks to the potent Granite Flasks and by virtue of being a ranged character, we can deal with most of this quite easily. For example, physical melee monsters are not usually a problem. However, things like Flicker Strikers, Leap Slammers, and ranged physical attackers that attack fairly rapidly but with big hits can cause some problems, especially if they have bonus physical damage mods. Running with a party as well as careful play and recognition of these traits will counter this weakness pretty much. Finally, the biggest strength of a setup like this isn't immediately obvious to the eye, it's flexibility. There are a lot of different ways to change around the passives, gear, and skill setups to suit your playstyle or current struggles in the game. The ability to easily pick and change things around for better resistances, better defense, or more damage is what really seals the Arc Witch as a solid choice for new players. Okay, so let's get down into the nuts and bolts of the build now, beginning with the passive tree. I'm going to break this down into stages so you guys can get an idea of both the skills and nodes we're getting, in addition to the progression route we're taking through the tree. Now, we begin Witch as the primary choice of class over, for example, say Templar and Shadow, which are both possibilities, and the reason why we take Witch is because Witch gets very efficient access to this side of the tree just here, just this little route here, basically. If you were to take Shadow or Templar, you would need to spend an extra point through Lord of the Dead here, which does nothing for this build, to be able to get that side. So Witch is the most efficient choice, but you do have the option of Shadow or Templar if for some reason you want to be those classes. Now, essentially, beginning off, we'll take the damage and cast speed nodes. All these nodes are really efficient here, and Elemental Dominion is also fantastic. We then go up through the mana regeneration into life and mana and grab the life nodes, which makes the early, this sort of clustering just here of nodes makes the early game progression very, very easy. From that point, we go up through the Flask effect nodes to leave the Witch. Now, the reason we grab the Flask effect nodes as an alternative to something like going through the spell damage is that this takes 4 points, firstly, to go through the spell damage, 4 points for 30% spell damage, whereas this is 3 points to get out of the tree. And the Flask effect nodes are actually really, really very powerful in this build. I did a very detailed explanation of exactly why the Flask effect nodes are fantastic in another video, which you can find in the description below. But essentially, they improve our character's armor, DPS, leeching, speed, and healing capabilities. Like, we get a lot of value from these nodes, to put it simply. We then come up through Deep Wisdom, down through here. You can grab some Dexterity here if you need it, and then you can also go into, so if you haven't got enough Dexterity in your gear for whatever stuff you're trying to use, to use certain pieces of gear, and then we grab the Life cluster just there, just for a bit of extra life. Pretty simple starting point. In Phase 2, we head down into Shadow, grabbing the cast speed and spell damage, and the shock cluster just here, which gives 5% chance to shock and additional lightning damage, in addition to these fantastic 2 life nodes here. We don't get the 20/20 life and mana node because 20 base life doesn't really work out to be all that much. You can grab it temporarily and respec out of it later on if you want though. And around that point where we finish up in Shadow, we grab Eldritch Battery, which converts whatever ES energy shield you happen to have at that point to extra mana and makes it very easy to supply our skills. Around this point, you should basically just be using the Clarity Aura and leveling that up as much as possible, and getting Eldritch Battery gives you plenty of mana buffer space to be able to use your skills. In Phase 3, we get all of our highway traveling out of the road. So essentially, after completing Eldritch Battery, we'll start heading down this way in the tree here. We can grab some life and mana nodes just here to sort of supply us for the journey. We'll come down and grab the Harrier node just here, which gives move speed and cast speed, fantastic for leveling. We'll shoot through the energy shield cluster here, which increases our mana thanks to Eldritch Battery. Then we can head up this side of the tree and sort of go over towards the Templar side and finish up with this life cluster just here to end out this phase. This essentially gets all of the racing through the long distances in the tree done in one go, so that we don't need to do it in the higher levels and sort of struggle with our character. Phase 4 is the Aura phase. In this phase, I like to come down and grab Shaper for extra mana and life regen. This makes the character a bit easier to play. And then we'll shoot down here, grab this Aura cluster just here, the entire Influence Aura cluster. We'll grab this one Aura Effect node. We don't need the reduced mana reservation. We should be able to support all our manas without it, all of our auras without it, sorry. And then we'll come up this way and into the Aura Effect and Sovereignty cluster just here, grabbing this side. Again, we don't need the reduced mana. We're able to run our auras just fine. And the Aura Effect nodes increase our mana regen and our total mana pool as well, thanks to the combination of Clarity and Discipline. So these work out very potently. The Aura Effect nodes that we get, so all of these guys, and these Influence cluster and this dude over here, all of those compile together to increase the maximum lightning resist we get from our Purity Aura, or if you're using any of the other purities, it'll increase the amount of resistances you get as well, making it easier to gear. And finally, in this phase, we'll come up and grab Purity Flesh cluster for a lot of extra life, and we'll grab the Static Blows cluster just here. This gives 20% chance to shock, and this makes Arc much more effective, and it makes your Totem much more effective as well. This is actually a huge boost to DPS, although it won't change your tooltip DPS. It means you're shock stacking monsters much more often and dealing more actual damage in the end. In the 5th phase, I recommend coming down into Templar. If you have max resistances, at this point you can grab Elemental Adaptation. That'll increase your maximum resistances, giving you a little bit more effect there. Actually, it's pretty potent. 2% max resistances doesn't sound like much if you're a new player, but it's actually very, very effective in reducing the amount of damage you take from elemental damage. We'll come up down into Templar here, grabbing Celestial Walker to give us some nice resistances, making it easier to gear, and a nice bit of extra damage. Prestidigitation gives cast speed and mana regeneration, fantastic stuff. And then we go into the awesome life nodes in the Templar side of the tree just here. And then the final phase is the completing your build, the rounding it out. You actually have a lot of options here, and I've spent entirely too many points. 5 points left on a build is overspending. Usually you'll aim for something between 10 and 20. And the reason for this is I've basically highlighted a bunch of nodes that you have the option of getting. So it's kind of up to you how you spend your points from here on out. Do you want more damage? Do you want more survivability? Do you want more mana? Etc, etc. Some of the options I'll point out are things like the Lightning Walker cluster here, just for straight up damage and lightning resistance. There's also the option to go down into elemental damage here. You can also pick up extra mana regeneration and extra life regeneration if you want. You can grab those 2 nodes just there. And you can go into the armor and energy shield cluster here, which will increase our physical mitigation by a little bit. It's not a big deal. Mostly though, it gives us extra ore resist and a lot of extra energy shield to be able to support additional mana on top of that. You also have the option of doing things like dropping the spell damage from Shadow if you like, and spending that on more survivability, like you can pick up these life and mana nodes just here for example. You can even pick up the extra life and chaos resistance node here, and even come down over to Shadow, spend 1 point to get to this life cluster just here for additional life. So as you can see, there's a lot of flexibility in the endgame build, and you can pick the clusters that suit your playstyle or that best sort of help you in your current situation. Okay, so now I'm going to explain the gearing that I use for this character, as well as some of the things you can switch around for different situations. So first up we have Joffrey's Crest. This is not a mandatory item, but it is a recommended item. It's a pretty solid choice. As I said, this build is pretty flexible. You can switch things around. Essentially, the reason we use this is it gives +1 to level of gems in this item, and it's a 4 link. So what that means is you can increase the level of arc, which increases the damage. Spells scale all of their damage off of their level. So leveling that up 1 extra level gives a nice extra boost of damage. And then Empower, even a level 1 Empower, jumps up to level 2, which then gives +1 to level of the supported skill gem as well, so that gives another level to Arc. You can see Arc is actually level 20 here, despite only having a level 18 base, thanks to that Empower. When Empower reaches level 2, it'll actually be level 3, and it'll give 2 levels to Arc, making it even more potent. So a level 1 Empower is okay on like a level 18 Arc. It's slightly better than added Lightning, I found from my testing. But once you get to level 2 and 3, and then eventually 4 Empower through corrupting the Empower, then you start to get huge amounts of damage from the Joffrey's Crest, and that's when it starts to exceed something like a 5 or 6 link. As I mentioned earlier, you can use a wand with +3, so you could use one with +1 to all gems and +3, and then just drop the Empower, and that kind of works in place of Joffrey's Crest. So if Joffrey's Crest is a bit expensive, which it has been thanks to the popularity of Arc lately, then you can just use that +3 wand as a sort of, a shoehorn Joffrey's Crest setup. As a general helmet, it's not too bad. It has a bit of resist, and it has, chaos. It has 4 resist, which is not something you see on all items, and a bit of extra armor, yes, it's not too bad just there. In that I use my Arc, Lightning Penetration, Empower setup with Spell Echo as well. And then if I'm doing a Reflect map, I'll switch out Empower for a Life Leech just there, and that helps with deal with a lot of Reflect. Now the next things I use, I dual wield Moonsirers. Moonsirers are just a nice stepping stone endgame item. I say stepping stone because these will eventually be replaced by a nice rare wand. What you're looking for on a wand is exactly what you see on a Moonsirer: spell damage, lightning damage, and cast speed. That combination of things. When you're looking for a rare one to replace Moonsirer, or one instead of Moonsirer, you're just looking for the highest total combined spell damage plus lightning damage, and then cast speed on top of that. So essentially this has 17 spell damage, 32 spell damage, and 25 lightning damage, all which just increases the damage of Arc straight up, and then a bit of cast speed. So Moonsirer is usually pretty cheap. They're usually like 1 or 2 chaos, and it's pretty easy to just chuck 2 of these on your character and get a lot of DPS that way, and then eventually wait until you find a better wand. Now, as you'll see, I am dual wielding Moonsirers, and this is what I usually rock. Most maps I'll rock this, just because the DPS boost you get from dual wielding them is pretty fantastic. You can see 5,400 there with both, down to 4,000 without the dual wielding, so it is quite potent. However, I will also use Sephel's frames from time to time. I use this in very dangerous maps, or reflect maps that, don't like, if there's like double reflect packs, or if it's a dangerous reflect map on top of that, especially if it has like a bit of minus max or something like that, minus max resistances. Sephel's can help counteract that. It's just a pretty nice shield to have handy, but certainly not mandatory for the build. All I'll do is I'll just swap out my skill gems from my lightning warp setup and put it in the Sephel's frame and rock that instead. And you can see that boosts up the all resistances quite a bit, and you get 85 lightning resist. With the 85 lightning resist, when you pop the topaz, you go up to 98 lightning resist, which is just about immune to lightning damage, so that is pretty potent, as you can imagine. Next up, I use the highly recommended Cloak of Defiance. This is Usually getting one of these without a 5 link or 6 link is pretty cheap. The prices are a bit high at the moment because of the popularity of Arc at the time of making this video, but generally Cloak of Defiance is something like 10 or 20 chaos. And what this gives us is the Mind Over Matter perk just there, the Mind Over Matter keystone passive essentially, and then an additional 10% damage is taken off mana before life in addition to that. So here's how Cloak of Defiance works for those of you guys who are less familiar with it. When you take damage, it comes into your character, it's split 60-40 to life and then mana. So 60% of the damage goes to your life, 40% of the damage goes to mana. So we have a fair bit of mana unreserved. I recommend somewhere between 700 and 1000 mana unreserved. As you can see, I have 926 life here. And what will happen is you'll take that damage to mana, your mana will go down, and then your high mana regen will regenerate that mana back up. And you'll often not really notice it unless you're taking tons of damage, and occasionally you'll go out of mana. But that's a small price to pay for having a huge amount of increased effective life. Essentially, you get 40% more effective life. If something was going to one-shot you, you can just basically add your mana on top of your life pool to work out your total life pool. So 900 plus 3,855 there. And then for small multiple attacks, it's actually much more potent than that because of our high mana regen. Keeps the mana up, so it's always going to be taking 40% of the damage off our character essentially. Now you can use Lightning Coil instead of Cloak of Defiance if you're worried about physical damage, but I really rate Cloak of Defiance. I mean, it's still 40% mitigation to physical attacks, and it works pretty fantastically in this setup in general. It's also very difficult to roll the correct color sockets on a Lightning Coil, so that's another thing to consider as a newer player. Now you don't need to use Cloak of Defiance until something like 70 plus maps. I went into like level 71 and 72 maps without Cloak of Defiance and was doing pretty reasonably. I was just using a rare with, you know, life and resist basically, and it worked pretty well as well. Next up on the gloves, I'm using just life and resist, pretty basic stuff. There's nothing else you really need on the gloves. If you get a bit of dexterity on the gloves, it is handy though. Gloves are a dexterity slot, so they can roll dexterity on them, and that helps you support a higher level Val Haste and eventually a higher level Arctic Armor, though it's not too hard to support the Arctic Armor right off the bat. But that's just one option for getting dexterity there. The boots are just life, resist, and move speed. Pretty simple stuff there. You can see I've got a combination of strength and life, which strength gives life at a ratio of 1 to 2, so that gives a 20 and a half life extra, so it's a pretty high life item just there, and that's all you're trying to do, stack life and resist on most of these. Move speed is nice, it reduces the time for lightning warp to take effect, and increases your mobility in combat as well. For our belt, you want life and resistances. The leather belt's a good option for extra life. However, other useful mods include things that increase the duration of your flasks or increase your flask charge recovery rate. Flasks are actually super important on this character, and using your flask correctly is very important. Having your flasks last longer and recharge quicker is going to be very potent. So those are nice mods to get. I don't have those on my belt, unfortunately. Rings and amulets are pretty much life and resist. If you can get any spell modifiers, spell damage, cast speed, those are going to be helpful, as well as increases to lightning damage, and same deal for the amulet. For my amulets and rings and everything, I pretty much just have a little bit of life and resist. You'll notice I have a little bit of dexterity on one of these guys as well, and that helps support Val Haste. Without any dexterity on gear, you can pretty easily get to like a level 8 or 9 Val Haste, but having a little bit of dexterity on one of your pieces of gear will let you take it beyond level 10, which it really doesn't make too much difference having a lower level Val Haste. It's still quite effective. So you'll notice I mentioned Flasks being very important in this character, and I want to drill this in as much as possible. Flasks are extremely potent. You'll remember we have those very nice Flask effect nodes, and that's just to further highlight how useful Flasks are in this character. One of the character's defensive weaknesses are low physical mitigation. You can see we have 6% as a base just there, which is not very much in high level maps. However, through having a perpetual of Iron-Skin Granite Flask just here, you can see that lasts for 4.8 seconds and gives us a huge amount of extra armor, gives us 3000 base armor, which is multiplied by the Flask effect nodes, giving us an extra 30% on top of that. And then we get the also increased armor effect. I have a 99% roll just here, which essentially doubles that, but also doubles the armor you have. And then that effect is increased by your Flask effect nodes as well. So just to demonstrate this, we go from 6% mitigation when I use the Flask, we go up to 53% mitigation. I get over 9,000 armor with this Flask just here, so it is extremely potent, and clever use of that is going to be crucial to surviving there's physical hitting, especially things like leap slammers and flicker strikers and stuff like that. Next up, I use the Atziri's Promise Amethyst Flask. This is one of the Atziri drops. This ends up being pretty cheap. You know, after the first week of leagues, it drops down to usually to like a chaos or 2 or something like that. And that is because it's just the most common drop from the Atziri fight. Now, you want to get one that has 15% elemental damage as extra chaos damage during effect. So what this does is essentially boosts our DPS and then gives us life leech. You'll see the 10% of chaos damage leached as life during Flask effect. So this gives us survivability or sustain and extra damage. Now you'll be able to see the amount of damage that I gain from using this just here goes up from 5,400 to 6,400, so an extra 1,000 DPS there during the effect. Now that's also chaos damage, which is, you know, if it's a lightning resistant mob, it's helpful to have something that they're not resistant to, that you're dealing damage of, so it helps with those mobs. And it's also non-reflectable. Chaos damage cannot be reflected, so these is fantastic for dealing with reflect as well, dealing extra damage without worrying about reflect. Next up, we use the Topaz Flask. This will make us near immune to reflect packs, so you just pop this whenever you see a reflect pack and then you go ham on them. The Flask effect node increases the maximum resistances we get from this as well. So instead of 10% max lightning, we get 13% max lightning, which is obviously very potent. And this is also very nice against Storm Heralds, Piety, anything else that deals lightning damage, so it's pretty nice stuff there. And then here's the life flasks I recommend. I recommend a Seething of Grounding, and this should be on the Hallowed base because this gives the maximum possible instant life heal. This is an instant life heal of close to 400 life. Now that is boosted by the Flask effect nodes as well, so it is actually over 400 life. And what you'll do is, in dangerous situations, if you get shocked or you're just taking a lot of damage, you can tap that multiple times really quickly to essentially heal a bunch of times. So you get 3 heals just there for about 1,000 life in less than a second, over 1,000 life in less than a second. So that's just a very fast emergency heal. And then the other one is the Sapping Sanctified Life Flask of Staunching. The Sanctified Life base gives us a very potent short duration heal, but it is a heal over time. And this is actually super effective. Now, Staunching is something you always want to run, so we just use that as the suffix. And then the Sapping is fantastic in this build. It removes 10% of the life recovered from this, so it's like 130. And then from our mana. So we do lose a bit of mana, but you'll see when I use this, the mana regenerates almost instantly. It's not an issue because we have such high mana regeneration. However, this is something like 1,1600 life over 3 seconds is a very, very potent heal over time. And you can essentially, as you're fighting, you'll pop the Granite Flask and you'll pop the Sapping Sanctified of Staunching, and you will become super, super tanky. So this is all multiplied by the Flask effect nodes, and it all makes your character feel much more powerful. If you are struggling in endgame content in general on any character, often it's the case of not using your flask correctly or not having the correct flasks. Flasks are very important in Path of Exile, and I wanted this sort of beginner's character here to highlight that fact as much as possible. So do try and learn to use those as best you can. Now, just as a final tip, I recommend leveling up as many useful gems as possible. Leveling up an extra arc allows you to use the GCP recipe, the Gem Cutter's Prism recipe on it. When you trade a level 20 arc with 1 GCP to a vendor, you get a level 1 arc with 20 quality back. Then you can level up that arc again, and then you can attempt to vial it and corrupt it to get a level 21 arc or an extra quality arc, which is going to be fantastic long-term investment. Plus, just leveling extra gems in general is good value. I also level added lightning damage because we'll be able to use the Gem Cutter's recipe on that as well, which will give us a quality added lightning for when we get a 5-link Cloak of Defiance. That'll help support our totem and help deal extra shock stacks. I also just keep my life leech in the offhand slot, keep it leveling and ready to switch out for Empower whenever I need to, as well as just whatever extra things I want to support. I have Elemental Weakness, which I can switch out for Conductivity for when I'm running with parties, and that's leveling up in the offhand slot as well. And that's pretty much it for this video guide. If you guys would like more information for this build, I highly encourage you to check out the description below where you can find links to the passives tree, a spreadsheet where I filled out a bunch of information as I was playing the character, including mapping, trading, items, gearing, gem slots, and all sorts of other stuff. And you'll also find a link to Foxtactics' full written guide on the forums for this style of which I highly recommend you guys having a read through if you're serious about playing a character like this. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this beginner's guide to the Foxtactics Lightning Arc Witch. That's it for now. I'm ZiggyD, and thanks for watching.